Okay, this is the reconvening during the convening, and I hope everyone who was here in the morning still a lot of things resonating in the little conversation, and that you enjoyed lunch. For those who have just recently arrived, we welcome you all. And I guess it seems a little odd. I'm welcoming you to the JTS library. We're not in the library, obviously, but you're going to be treated to some of the phenomenal and unique resources of the library, and that you will be have this presented to you by Dr. David Kraemer, who is the Dora and Joseph Abbell Librarian and Professor of Talmud and Rabbinics here at JTS. He's written many articles and books on rabbinics, dealing with all sorts of issues, not necessarily, although he, like every professor, loves the arcana of the ancient world, but has a unique knack, I have found, of relating them to issues that are very much contemporary for all of us as well. And he has a special love for the library and its resources, and it's a pleasure to introduce him to you now. I should note one thing. At the end of this session, there'll be a 15-minute break before the following one, and we do want to hand out index cards and pencils for anyone who wants them for questions in not in this session, but in the following one. So if you happen to be sitting here for those 15 minutes, you should know, maybe just walk outside and pick up a card, but we won't be able to give it to you as you walk in.
Thank you, Gordon. Okay, is my voice clear? Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. So let me tell you what we're going to do now. We've got until 1:30 officially, and I am going to make sure that this is all finished by 1:30. And what we're going to do is as follows. We will begin here. We are here, obviously. I just said something obvious. We're beginning here because the rare materials are relatively small, right? We're not talking about screen size. We're talking about at largest book size, large book size. And it would not be comfortable to have everybody standing around together in our presentation room, which is across the atrium, while I went through and explained each of the works that I'm going to reference. So in order to make things easier, I'm going to show you a series of materials, almost all of which, there's one exception, almost all of which are from the collections of the library here at the Jewish Theological Seminary, and then I'm going to finish that presentation at about a quarter after, maybe a little bit after that, but not by much, because I want to provide you with the opportunity to see many of these materials in person. And we have set them up in a room that's straight across the atrium. It's called the presentation room. So when I'm finished, I'll encourage you to go over there. And it's a heck of a lot more interesting to see these works in person than it is to see them on screen. So I encourage you to follow up with that. Anti-Semitism and allyship. Chris, are you in the room? Could you turn down the volume just a little bit? I hear a little bit of feedback. The rare materials, for those of you who don't know, we here at the Jewish Theological Seminary in our library have one of the few most outstanding collections of rare Judaica anywhere in the world. I mean, literally there's a handful that would be in the same league as we are. And what that means is that virtually any topic that you are going to be interested in that relates to Judaica, you can take advantage of our collection. In many cases, you will, if you're going to do a responsible job, literally have to come and consult our rare collection in order to write your book, your article, to do your scholarship. These are of popular interest as well, and one of the things that I like to emphasize when we look at these rare materials is how much resides not in the technical details of the text, but in substance, in the quality of material, in the images, and so forth. And that's what we're going to look at here. As is always the case, the images that we're going to be looking at are subject to interpretation. So you should think, as you see an image, what you see there, and I will offer some questions about the images. I do have to say that we've got a small anti-Semitic collection. We don't specialize in that, but, there's a lot of anti-Semitism through the ages, so even if you've got a small collection, there's something to see, right? Anyhow, I will show you those materials, but I also want to emphasize the allyship part of it, both sides, and you'll consider whether you think my interpretations are valuable or not. If you think I'm wrong, please feel free to speak to me afterwards. So we're going to start right over here, and it's going to be hard for you to see. All of the materials are labeled, but the contents of them may not be so obvious. So what you've got here is, as you can see, a 19th century lithograph representing Jews gathered inside one of the synagogues in the Roman complex of synagogues. And this was part of the last exhibition we had was, images of synagogues, prints of synagogues, the history of synagogues from around the world, primarily Europe, but elsewhere as well. And there are two things that are worth noting here. The first part of this presentation is the anti-Semitism part of the presentation. You will notice that this is not a well-tamed crowd. Right? The nature of the interchange, the chaos, the sense that here they are in a synagogue, presumably for purposes that a synagogue would invite you to gather for. There's someone you can see back on the other side of the curtain who's looking with great suspicion over at what everybody else is doing. But the common interpretation of this, which seems perfectly reasonable, is that it represents Jews in a negative light. I think that's reasonable. What may be harder for you to see is that around the top there is a Hebrew inscription. You see above the columns and below the frieze, you can see the Hebrew inscription. It is biblical text, which you would expect, but the actual text that's represented there is very unexpected. And I have not been in this room, but I'm fairly sure that that's not what actually is there. You can see that, pick it up, Shein tachat shein, Yad tachat yad, Regel tachat ragel. This is a quotation from the Torah, where it says that there should be eye for eye, tooth for tooth, nail for nail. This, I think, is also a negative representation from a Christian perspective of the Jewish community and the insistence on strict, cruel justice as opposed to mercy. Okay, so interesting example number one. All of the following images are from an exhibition that we did right over here called The Jewish as Other. This is the old library, as you can see. This exhibition, when we didn't really have good exhibition space yet, was from 1995, but it was a very interesting exhibition, and there's some important material here in representation of anti-Semitism. So London, 1792, these are in chronological order. As you'll see, all of these are from Britain over the course of a century, and you can see that it's labeled, right, I've got the monish, right, I've got the money. This will again and again and again represent Jews as speaking in a tongue that's virtually incomprehensible. These will over and over again make fun of the way Jews speak. What's interesting of this particular, if you look at it carefully, on the one hand, you've got the stereotypical beard, hook nose, right? Everything here will fit the anti-Semitic stereotype, typically represented in Ashkenazi Jews. But then if you look at the hat, the wig, the cane, right, and the coat, This is more typical of the dress in England at the time of Sephardi Jews, and more particularly, probably a Sephardic broker. And so even those with money partake of this very negative image, and there's no doubting, both in the quotation and in the image, how this is meant to be understood. The next, let me go make sure I've got this in order. So you can see London, 1824. The images in this case are actually not as bad in terms of the physiognomy, is that the way the word is pronounced, as the one we saw before, but the fact that you've got the Jew on the right who is selling and the cooperating younger Jew on the left who at the same time is picking the pocket of the mark here, the Christian mark. And you can see, to cry old clothes, I go my rounds. Clothes, right? I cheat them all so clean. The coat would cost £1,000. I buy them for 15. I sell a watch for Moshe, good deal. I skip a little bit here, right? I catch a thief, the watch to steal. Okay? Next. This, I mean, you can see, it's marked on a merchant tailor, any old clothes to sell, right? Again, that may be the representation of the Jew, right? The facial images, again, the representation of the Jew, although it's very interesting that this image is actually not labeled as a Jew, and it appears in a book that is about the degradation of the English language. Right? And so it talks about people involved in certain professions who don't speak a proper English, who have weird dialects, weird pronunciations, and so forth. So I think that they were right, this was before my time, to include this in the exhibit, but both the context of the book and the lack of a specific label here make it interesting to me because Jew? Yeah, but Jews are not alone in this. It's in the context of a larger degradation, or at least observation of the degradation of language on the part of certain professions in England at the time. Again, the emphasis on money, get money, money still, and let virtue follow if she will. London, 1808. I don't have much to add to this, right? All of the stereotypes are present, the representation of the same stereotypes. What does mark this here explicitly as Jews, aside from the facial features, is you can see above the hat on the right, it says Solomon, right? So this is representing Jews probably conspiring over some kind of business deal, and certainly not a positive. Now, none of that, I imagine, will have surprised you. The next couple, I think, will also not surprise you, but I want to make them a little bit more complicated than we might otherwise understand them to be. This is a partial image. You can see I had to cut it off at the top in order to fit it. This image, you will be able to see the whole image inside the presentation room. We've got it laid out so you can look at it. These images, by the way, are in color inside. So you can see I marked there things to note, one of which is unfortunately partially cut off at the top. There is a cordial glass and a money purse. You see the woman there who is holding a purse by her side. It's very interesting. Jew rabbi turned to a Christian. That is to say, not that the rabbi is becoming a Christian, but turning to a Christian in temptation, and their union, right, which presumably is a sex for purchase union. That's what the purse seems to indicate. On the wall to the top right, and you can see this more clearly when you see it in person, there's actually the image of a devil's face, right? So this is the union that is brought together by the devil. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, it's very, very interesting to me that the stereotypes, right, we saw in the prior images, none of them is present here. right? Both the woman and the man are represented in dignity. They are dressed in dignified fashion, as you'll see when you go inside and see her headdress and the like. This is an upper-class patron who is engaging a woman who is at least very, very finely outfitted. I ask the question, the lack of the anti-Semitic representation, along with the recognition that there is some attraction, right? That's what the label at the bottom suggests. There's some attraction that's possible between this Christian woman and this rabbi, this Jewish man. What does that indicate? It's not only negative, right? There is something here about people being lustful for or attracted to other people, whatever their religion is. Another example of this, right? This goes back to the stereotype, but again in a very interesting way. London, 1807. Solomon, again, Solomon was the stereotype name that was used in England for the Jewish man during this period. Solomon in all his glory. Now, his face is unmistakably represented according to the negative Jewish stereotype, but his dress is fine. He is clearly a person of some means, and he is out doing, what some men do, that is to say, looking for a relationship, and he is being seduced by the women who, as you can see, are on Petticoat Lane. Right? Again, what does it mean when people get together in order to have these relationships? What are the consequences? I'll reference this quickly. I don't have an image for this because there is no image for it, but we've got in our collection a letter from the Cairo Geniza that addresses, I believe, if I'm remembering this correctly, Maimonides' son in Cairo. It is a formerly Christian woman whom a Jewish traveler, a merchant, had met in Rome. They developed a relationship, and he brought her to Cairo, where she converted, and they got married. She had a young child, and she's writing to the rabbi, saying that he's abandoned me to live in an apartment with a Muslim woman. Okay, so what does it mean when people, men and women, have relations, right? In that kind of intimate fashion, they live together. They don't, in this case, at least in the Muslim case, convert. There's a lot more complexity here than we often account for. Now, the next thing I'm going to show you asks us to look on the other side, because hate rarely has one side. There is considerable suspicion that we see in most of these images, though there's some complexity as well. I would argue, I think hate is not an unfair way to describe at least some of what we see here, but hate on one side doesn't stand alone. So, and here I just want to ask us, we should not look for which hate comes first, right? In my opinion, that is not a fruitful pursuit. Who hated who before the other hated, right? When people are engaged in relationships of suspicion or hate, you tend to find it on both sides. So here we are back with the Cairo Geniza. This one is labeled the Schechter Geniza because we have a small, about 50 items that Salman Schechter brought when he came to be the first president of the reconstituted Jewish Theological Seminary. Most of our collection does not come from Schechter. It comes from another collection that we purchased in the 1920s. In any case, some of you are already reading. For those who understand Hebrew, this is actually fairly well written, even for the 12th century, so you won't have any difficulty making sense of it, again, if you're a Hebrew reader. This is from the daily prayer, the prayer that would be recited by a Jew 3 times a day, according to prescription, right? So morning, afternoon, and evening. And you will see that I have isolated in the middle the prayer that asks God to eliminate enemies. So what does it say? L'mishumadim al tihi tikva im lo yashuvu l'taratecha. Right? For those who have turned aside, right, may they have no hope, right, if they do not return to your Torah. Okay, that's an internal statement. But then it goes on and says, Hanotzrim, Christians, v'haminim, sectarians, unnamed, hanotrim v'haminim, karega yovedu. May Christians and sectarians be destroyed in an instant. Okay? It's not an outreaching for friendship and allyship, right? Hate goes two ways. Now, let me see if I'm remembering where you are. Okay, so let me go back here. You'll look at this while I just add a little bit. That was the anti-Semitism with a little bit of complexity, hate side of things. I now want to offer you a few materials on what I will call allyship, though I don't think the term is quite what's meant in the larger context of what we're doing. The simple fact is that when people live together, and particularly when there's a minority community in the context of a larger, though not large, non-minority community, in this case Jews, are going to need allies. You can't live in a small community with neighbors with very few Jews, as was typically the case in medieval Europe, without having allies, without being able to rely on your neighbors for the basic needs of living. So that kind of allyship always existed, even if there were other forces, other trends. And there's very interesting evidence of that kind of allyship. So here I'm going to give you a couple of examples that I found when I was doing research on Jewish eating practices, then show you some images that we can interpret in the same light. Two comments from Tosfot, the successors of Rashi in 12th century Ashkenaz, France and nearby. According to one opinion that's recorded in the Tosfot, Jews are granted permission to use mills and ovens belonging to Christian priests to prepare their own bread. Right? In a small community, in a small town, where there were a couple of hundred people and probably a couple of dozen Jews at most. And most people won't have ovens because ovens are very rare. If you ever want bread, you're going to have to rely on your neighbors. Right? And so the permission that's given here, despite the fact that it's contrary to Talmudic law, is yes, you may use the ovens that belong to priests and prepare your bread in those ovens. Or another example. There are those who permit, this is also from the same period, same source, there are those who permit the purchase of warm bread from Gentiles on the Sabbath. Purchase of warm bread from Gentiles on the Sabbath, permitted. Now, I take it for granted that purchase doesn't mean purchase here, because rabbis certainly would not have permitted Jews to go out and literally purchase bread at a baker on the Sabbath. What I assume this means is that neighbors being neighbors, everyone in a small town knowing one another, if a Jew wanted warm bread on the Sabbath, they would go to the baker would know them and recognize them and trust them, and so they would know that the bill would be paid sometimes after the bread was taken. But that kind of cooperation, that kind of trust, certainly existed in many of these communities. Otherwise, the communities couldn't have survived. A little bit later, this is from a Viennese rabbi who lived between 1200 and 1270, and this is a very interesting statement. He says, everyone, meaning every Jew, has grown accustomed to purchase bread from his good friend the Gentile. Right? The Hebrew word here, I translated it as good friend, but a more literal translation, the Hebrew word is ohavo. Right? So to be literal about it, every Jew has grown accustomed to purchase bread from his lover, the Gentile. And they don't worry about his daughters. That's saying they don't worry about the Jew perhaps being attracted to the daughters of the Gentile. Again, back to the problem of sexual attraction. But again, here you can see they're perfectly comfortable in a rabbinic source, speaking of the warm, close relations between Jews and their neighbors. So if we go on here, it's very interesting. This is our copy of a work called the Machzor Vitri. It is the first complete record of Ashkenazic law and practice. We've got the earliest, most complete manuscript of that work, and I draw your attention just to the little sketches at the bottom, the drawings at the bottom. You can see on the right you've got a peahen feeding her young. And on the left, you can see either a knight on horseback with his sword drawn, although given the context, it looks more like a hunting scene than it does a war scene. So on the left, you can see someone about to kill the stag, right? And on the bottom, you can see the hunting horn is being blown. What does this have to do with the contents of a work of Jewish law and practice in the 13th century? Absolutely nothing. It is simply an expression of the comfort of the people creating this manuscript with their medieval French setting. And there are many other examples of this in this same manuscript. Okay, so this is allyship. We go on. This is where cultures share, where Jews adapt and create and use even Christian craftspeople in order to help to create. This I can't show you. It's not in the room because you will find it at the Metropolitan Museum right now on special exhibition, our Rothschild Machzor. And all I draw your attention to here is not Moses standing, on the mountain with the angels coming out. That's all very cute. But notice the dress of the Jews, having come out of Egypt, right, at the bottom of the mountain. Every single one of them is dressed in fine Italian garb, showing, again, their acculturation, their at-homeness in this larger setting, even despite the fact that, of course, the other emotions or the other forces are sometimes at work as well. Here's a wonderful example, and I'm going to let you be the next, 60 people in the survey I've been running for the last 20 years. So this is, as you can see, a Haggadah. It's from northern Italy, 1515. It was created, at least the writing, by a very famous scribe. And you see the table scene at the bottom. Okay, so what does that remind you of? Okay, Last Supper, right? Anyone want to argue for something else? It is a Seder, but it's the Last Supper as a Seder. What's very, very interesting, so as I said, 1515, the Last Supper was painted in Milan in the 1490s. We don't know who the artist here was, but it's certainly possible that the artist actually saw the Last Supper. If not, what's very, very clear here is the broader cultural influence, the fact that artistic cultures and assumptions are shared by Christians and Jews alike. And there were 4 workshops who worked on the art of this absolutely magnificent manuscript, one of which, at least, was clearly Christian. This is not in our collection, but it's just such a fantastic example that I couldn't avoid it. You can see it's still Italy. Jews in Italy were doing fairly well, at least some Jews in Italy. As you can see, we're doing fairly well. 1469, we've got an identification of who this woman is. If I took the Hebrew away from this and asked you just to look at the image, you would say, Renaissance Italy. Right? Probably a Christian woman. You would have no way of distinguishing. And yet, what's most interesting here, when you look at the Hebrew on the side, some of you will recognize this. What is the Hebrew from? It's Havdalah. Right? The end of the Sabbath. You can see some of the words Havdalah. So here you've got a woman holding this very, very elaborate, bejeweled, cup of wine and herself writing Havdalah. That is her participation in the culture. This culture didn't end with the establishment of ghettos in northern Italy, which were actually founded just a year after the Haggadah that I showed you a couple of slides ago. You can see northern Italy, 18th century, what my predecessors, and I followed their path in this, have always enjoyed showing. This is a kosher Megillah for reading on Purim. You could read it from beginning to end and fulfill your obligation. It's the naked torso at the opening, right? That's fairly striking. Now, of course, no one living in Italy at this time would have been surprised by this at all, right? What's surprising is that you've got Jews creating a Megillah that fully follows those assumptions, cultural and otherwise. And let me see, was that the last one? That's the last one. So let me tell you what I'd like to do. Lights up. I'd like to invite you to go out and straight across. Many, though not all of these materials, are laid out on table in the presentation room right across. Please line up so you can go around them. And while I have you as a sort of captive audience, I also want to invite you, while you are here, either later today or tomorrow, we've got an absolutely fantastic exhibit that's now open in the library, and so I encourage you to do that. It's on imagery, visual representation in Kabbalah. Since you raised your hand so quick, and I'll respond quickly.
Is it okay to take photos?
It is okay to take photographs, just don't touch. Thank you very much. Oh, and I want to add, there was an image that was shown earlier of a Haggadah produced by survivors after the Holocaust. We have a copy of that, and since I saw it, I added that to what's being shown over there, if you want to see it.